Brilliant. Thank you so much. Well, look, thank you so much, Anna. Thanks for this invitation to speak to you. I just want to say that I'm going to give you a bit of a sort of run through of Vision Zero, but this is far, far, far from comprehensive. It's really just to give you some sense of it and just to try and probably imperfectly give some context in relation to York and North Yorkshire. And these are just some ideas. You know, some of this stuff, you know, you may agree with, you may not agree with, but it's really just to give you a sense of the territory. Next slide, please, Andy. So we're going to look at three things, really. Sort of Vision Zero, what is it? Have a bit of a sense of it in the UK. York and North Yorkshire, what's the current position? Then we're going to sort of talk about some of the approaches that are involved in Vision Zero. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the current strategy that around road safety and reducing danger on York's roads is bound up in the York and North Yorkshire Road Safety Partnership Safer Road Strategy, from which was published and approved in December 2021. It covers the period from 2021 to 26. And I mean, what's exciting about it is there's the language is in here is of, you know, zero vision, Vision Zero. It's adopted and part of the strategies of a number of really significant organisations such as National Highways, Yorkshire and North Yorkshire County Council, and obviously the North Yorkshire Police and Crime Commissioner. So obviously, you know, there's going to be structural changes to administration in North Yorkshire in the coming months. But I think there's a strong basis here. There are problems with this, though. It's good in as much as it's based around the safe system approach. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it does have a really good thing, which is rate-based reductions in casualties. But there's no targets in there, and I think that's a real omission. Some of the delivery of the strategy isn't particularly strong. For a very obvious example is the fact it talks about 20 mile an hour only in priority areas, and I think that is a real issue. Next slide, please, Andy. And that's a real contrast, say, with some of the other Vision Zero plans that there are in the UK. The most notable of that, I think, has been drawn up by Transport for London. The original report was launched action plan was launched in July 2018. Progress report much stronger in November 2021. Some really strong delivery elements to this, but the really key thing is that there's a final target of zero fatal and serious road injuries in London by 2041, and a plan that includes interim targets, one of which was last year, 2 years ago, 2022, and there's an interim target for 2030. So this really is a very strong way of showing your intent. Next slide, please. So to give you a sense of the Vision Zero territory, so it's typically formed by five core elements: safe speeds, safe streets, safe vehicles, safe behaviours, learning from collisions when they occur. But we think really strong and important and missing from much of the approach is the idea of less traffic. You know, I think we'll come on to this in more detail later, but you can't just get significant casualty reductions without being committed to less traffic. It just isn't going to happen, and we'll see later where this has been done successfully. Reducing traffic levels are a core part of it in cities. And I think the other additional thing is that once we get into this territory of a safe, fair environment for people, you don't just reduce casualties. You're also creating conditions where people want to walk, wheel and cycle and take public transport, and people feel able to do that. So it becomes an environment where it's one that ties in with climate change objectives and other things. So it's a really powerful approach. So just to run through a number of aspects in York and North Yorkshire. Thanks, Andy. So I just want to this is a crash map, and these are fantastic resource. I mean, there's probably quite a few different types of them, but you can create maps yourself. You can look at where casualties occur through the link there, www.crashmap.co.uk. This is looking at York only. It's only looking at serious and fatal casualties for the last 5 years. And what you can see here is the serious casualties are shown in red, fatal casualties are shown in black. And what you can see is that casualties are focused on places on main roads where people and vehicles mix. And it's important to note that in an urban environment like York, and this is typical of many built-up areas, almost half, often more than half of serious and fatal casualties are people who are walking and cycling. And you'll see, and again, if you look at this in a bit more depth, the junctions are key. It's they're the intersections where people are often seriously injured. Next slide, please. And then looking at a more rural location, and this is more typical of North Yorkshire. You can see those main roads are very much, the focus of where casualties occur. They are the serious and fatal casualties are occurring there. If you look again in Malton, which is in the bottom left-hand corner, you can see there's a more typical casualty position in a built-up area where the main roads through the town are the ones where danger is at its greatest. Thank you, Andy. And if we look at the numbers of casualties that have occurred firstly in York, we can see that the picture has been quite good over time. The total number of people killed and seriously injured has fallen over time. These are figures that are adjusted for some changes that occurred in the accounting methodology of about 4 or 5 years ago. But as you can see, there has been a reduction, less so since 2020. But pedestrians and cyclists make up over 50% of all the serious and fatal casualties in the city. Thank you, Andy. And then looking at North Yorkshire, it's a different picture here. Again, a fall in casualty numbers over time, which is positive, but much higher proportions of people in motor vehicles only. So 45% of casualties are car occupants, and then far more significant motorcycle riders. They make up almost a third of casualties. So in the urban environment and in the less built up areas such as across North Yorkshire, different jobs to be done. Thank you, Andy. And again, just going back to give you a sense of the picture of traffic volumes, and as you can see, that there's been 2 points at which traffic volumes have not been rising steadily. One was after the 2008 recession, and then obviously the shock of the pandemic in 2020. Big reductions then, but as you see, the general pattern is for motor vehicle volumes to increase, and in 2022 they were 28% higher in 1993. So I think we would argue, we'll come to this a bit later, it's very, very hard to get significant casualty reductions when you've got this rising volumes of motor vehicles. Thank you, Andy. So look, let's have a look now at some of the approaches that are involved in Vision Zero. And next slide, please. So one of the things that we argue for most strongly is, that unless you have speeds that people who are walking and cycling feel comfortable in and are safe in, then you're really going to struggle to have a fair balance for people and vehicles in towns. And for example, Transport for London, that for casualties where a person dies or is seriously injured, more than a third, almost 2/5 of those, they estimate speed is a factor. When they look in depth at, when the Metropolitan Police look in depth at fatal crashes and the significant factors there, they find speeding to be speeding to be a factor in almost half of fatal crashes. And we know from a really significant piece of research by the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine back in 2009, when we reduce the maximum speed of vehicles in built-up areas to 20 miles an hour, that's linked to a 42% reduction in road casualties. So speed is very significant, and reducing it to that magic level of 20 miles an hour has a huge impact. Thank you. And quite excitingly, and this is, a lot of the work that 20sPlenty had been involved in, is just to show how speeds, when you move to a 20 mile an hour speed limit, although the average speed may only fall by a little, maybe 1 to 2 miles an hour, the reductions on arterial roads, and we saw how important that they were, those main roads, those arterial roads, we saw how important they are to the number of casualties. The speeds on those roads fall to a greater degree, and that's really important because a 1% fall in average speeds is linked to a 6% decline in casualties. So any reductions you can get in average speeds makes a real difference. Here's some early results from the 20 mile an hour rollout in Wales, which obviously was a feature of last autumn. That initial results showed a 2.9 reduction in average speeds. In 2022, research from the Scottish Borders Council found that speeds were being reduced by 3 miles an hour on average and 6 miles an hour on the faster roads. And then just again to back this up, 2023 data for Transport for London, when they introduced 20 mile an hour on a number of arterial roads across central London, that showed speeds reducing by between 2 miles an hour and 5 miles an hour, where 20 mile an hour was introduced. So really significant reductions in average speeds on those more major roads from 20 mile an hour introduction. Thank you, Andy. And then enforcement's a really important issue in this. So in London, a lot of the work to support the rollout of 20 mile an hour across streets in London has been the commitment of the police to enforce a great higher levels of speeding offences. So at the minute, they were languishing down at around 100,000 speeding offences being prosecuted in 2018. It's up to 500,000 now. In a couple of years ago, and the commitment is that by the end of this year, it'll be up 2024-25, it'll be 1 million speeding offences. So people in London know that there's significant commitment to enforcement in the capital, and that also adds to the sense that speeding is an important issue that is being treated seriously by the police. Really exciting too is the fact that, 5 years ago, 20 mile an hour limits were not part of the speed enforcement regime. Now they make up well over a third of all speeding offences that are prosecuted across London. And what's also really exciting is the Metropolitan Police, their commitment to enforcement is shown by they want to respond to requests for enforcement by local communities. And what they've now got is 5 new laser cam 4 mobile cameras, which are able to be sited all over the capital. And so when communities say there's an issue in this road, the police can respond to that and enforce accordingly. So the police are much lighter on their feet, much more committed to this issue. Thank you, Andy. Again, we talked about junctions and crossings earlier on. More than 2/3 of deaths and serious injuries to pedestrians, cyclists and motorcyclists in London occur at junctions. People at greatest risk when crossing provision is non-existent or poor, where they have to wait too long to cross. Ensuring that people can cross the road safely is really important. And as you can see on those main roads where casualties occur, it's often about where people cross the road or want to cross and the facilities are poor. Thank you, Andy. Safe space for cycling. So this is a really important issue, and York is blessed by the fact although cycling levels appear to be on the decline, levels of cycling in York are high. But here again, there's issues that are clear ways of making cycling safer. 74% of all fatal and serious cycling casualties occur in urban areas, principally in those main roads. What's really interesting is that Copenhagen, where it introduced protected cycle tracks over the last 25 years, they've reduced the risk of cycling by 72% per cycle kilometre. So we would argue, and we'll come to this a tiny bit later, is that in residential areas, people need to make sure there's far less through traffic and traffic on those roads and streets. However, on the main roads where people are going to cycle, they need protected cycle routes. Thank you, Andy. And just come on that issue of less traffic. So the research, there's really amazing research been done by Todd Littman from the Victoria Transport Policy Institute in Canada. And what he's found in his research is that exposure to road traffic is a risk for both those inside and outside the vehicle. And there's a number of examples here, but perhaps the most obvious one that we would cite recently is that, in the pandemic, when the traffic volumes fell significantly, numbers of road casualties also fell significantly as well. And what we've seen is that as traffic volumes have risen again across the UK, numbers of casualties have risen almost hand in hand with the increase in traffic levels. So what is really important, I think, is that's why we feel that less traffic is very much a part of the conversation when it comes to reducing casualties and Vision Zero. Thank you, Andy. And then another thing, again, this can be controversial, but where we remove through traffic from neighbourhood streets, it makes a huge difference to casualties. And again, this tied into the exposure that people face from traffic on their streets. Research that was done from the low traffic neighbourhoods that were brought in London in 2020 has found significant casualty savings and really major traffic casualty savings amongst pedestrians, which were down dramatically. Thank you, Andy. And I don't know whether you know this. I just thought it'd be interesting to introduce this to people as a bit of a tool. There's some really interesting and high quality mapping being done by the government as part of the 2021 census. And one of the aspects of this, and the link is at the bottom there, is just showing the proportion of households that don't have a motor vehicle. And across the UK now, around 3/4 of households do have access to motor vehicle. And York is, across the whole of York is roughly in line with that, where 24% of households don't have a van or a car. But what's really interesting is, and the deeper the blue, the fewer the cars per household, what we find is there are large parts of the York city centre where more than half of households don't own a car. In a couple of other areas, Heworth South and the Groves and Clifton North, a lower proportion than the city average own a car. So I think that's really exciting in terms of the opportunities that you have to start to reduce the impact of motor vehicles in those areas in particular. Thank you, Andy. And just coming towards the end now, but I just wanted to touch on safe vehicles, because I think there are real opportunities to reduce the impact. I think what tends to have happened over the last 20 years is that cars themselves have become safer for people inside the vehicles. So, you know, the advantage of introduction of a huge number of technological improvements has meant that relatively people who are car occupants are much less likely to be killed or seriously injured compared with people walking, cycling or motorcycling. But what's really interesting now is that it's starting to turn where there are technologies that start to improve safety for people outside the vehicle. And one of these is intelligent speed assistance, basically speed limiters. And there's a really interesting study where these were fitted in 360 vehicles in the TfL van fleet recently. And what they found was there was a huge 62% reduction in speeding incidents amongst vehicles fitted with intelligent speed assistance. So, you know, the idea of being able to limit speeds is again associated with significant reductions in potential reductions in casualties. Thank you, Andy. So am I going to go through this? I'll go through this really quickly. So this is a summary, and hopefully this will be, you know, a useful thing to leave behind. Here are the sort of headings of the things we think need to occur for a thorough and well-rounded Vision Zero action plan. A default 20-mile-an-hour speed limit on all roads where people and vehicles mix, and where speeds remain high on some roads, there are engineering and design changes that can be made to increase compliance. And there's a really good piece of work done by Transport for London called the Achieving Lower Speeds Toolkit, which gives guidance to this. Safe main roads and town centres, got to address these crossings and junctions. We need single stage, direct crossings. We need frequent formal crossings. Where there are signalised junctions, they should have a pedestrian phase on all of the arms of the junction. And also they should be crossings by bus stops. Reducing capacity on main roads in town centres, no more than a single carriageway for general traffic where people and vehicles are mixing. Need to have accessible pavements with drop curbs at all junctions and crossings. We talked about safe space for cycling, protected lanes on main roads, removing through traffic on neighbourhood streets, creating links between low traffic neighbourhoods for safe navigation and safe routes, default 20-mile-an-hour speed limit. Less traffic, support for road pricing that can have a tremendous effect on the volumes of vehicles, removing traffic through neighbourhood streets, addressing parking costs. Again, small increases in parking costs, especially if you do it by size, weight or emissions of the vehicle, that can have a huge impact on the choices that people make. Safe vehicles, we talked about intelligent speed assistance. And then another really important thing is thinking about younger people. It's really important to create safe routes to school. There's been a really strong initiative around school streets, but it's really important that we address the whole route to school, hence a default 20-mile-an-hour speed limit, hence the importance of safe neighbourhood streets. So it's not just that last 100 yards, 200 yards before the school. The whole route to school is made safe so that young people feel able to walk and cycle there. Next one, Andy, I think we're coming towards an end now. So just to say that Vision Zero ties in with other strategies such as net carbon, improvements in the environment for streets, address road casualties, air quality, CO2 emissions, community, jobs, and public health. Thank you. And then just to say this can work. And it's really, there's two amazing examples from Oslo and Helsinki. And in both those cities, sort of 30 years ago, 50 people were being killed on those roads. In both those cities, no one was killed in 2019. Both cities have worked to reduce the dominance and speed of motorised traffic. Helsinki lowered speeds, prioritised pedestrians and active travel, introduced raised crossings, roundabouts, pedestrian islands, traffic calming, narrow roadways. So all those things we've talked about. Oslo reduced the number of cars that were driving in the city, reduced parking, lowered speeds, introduced cycle lanes, introduced pedestrian infrastructure and closed roads to through traffic. And in Oslo in 2019, there were no pedestrians, cyclists, or children killed. So this is not just pie in the sky. In a city like York, if you take some of the lead from cities like Ghent, where they've introduced circulation plans which reduce through traffic and have had real impacts on traffic volumes, this can have a tremendous effect towards Vision Zero goals. Thank you, Andy. And just to finally, some more references there and some contact details if you'd like any support from us. Thank you so much.